Okay, if I can get everyone's attention, we're going to go ahead and get class started. And tonight we have with us Taylor Reeder and her husband. What's your husband's name?
Drake.
Drake. Drake Reeder. And okay, Taylor is an extension agent horticulturist in Williamson County, and her husband is a landscape architect. So they're going to be teaching us landscape design. And so, Taylor, thank you for being online to teach for us tonight. We appreciate your time. And if you're good to go.
All right, wonderful. Thank you, Carla. Can y'all hear me well?
Yes.
Yes, I've got to turn it as loud as I can.
All right, sounds good. I will talk loud. It is not something I have any problem with doing. So thank y'all for having me tonight. We're going to go through some different aspects of landscape design. Now, I don't know how much y'all have studied landscape design or thought about landscape design or researched, but we're going to go through some basic principles of landscape design that I think make it easier to apply this if you're doing your own. So, or if you're doing it for someone else. Oftentimes, when we consider landscape design, we think of hiring out a service. Which is what my husband does for a living, is commercial mixed-use residential design. And so we think about hiring that out, but it's actually something that you could do yourself. Something that may seem daunting, may seem intimidating, but it's not. Really, it boils down to the principles of design. And once you understand those basic principles, it's a lot easier to think through the process. So that's something we're going to go through. We're going to go through the principles of design. We're going to go through why do we have landscape design? Why do we need it? What purpose does it serve? And then we're going to go through the actual design process, which is where my husband will step in and talk about what he does on a day-to-day basis of implementing designs and drawing and using computer-aided design so that he can make those for different companies, homeowners, whoever else his clientele might be, using that design process to put pencil to paper or pen to paper or mouse to computer, however you end up doing that design process. And at the end of the this section, then we'll go into some of my favorite landscape plants. So I know y'all have already went through herbaceous ornamentals. You've already been through shrubs and trees. But I'm going to talk about some alternative plants that I like for tough landscapes. So plants that we normally would pick that don't do well, and some alternatives for those. So let's get this started. So why design? Why do we do it? What does it serve? Of course, it's aesthetically pleasing. It looks good. It is, nice to look at. Makes your house look better, makes your property look better. But why do we do it? Well, design has actually more value than just aesthetics, just looking good. With designs, we can have a low maintenance landscape. A lot of times when we think about design, we think of over the top and Bouchard gardens and botanical gardens. And it doesn't have to be that deep. It doesn't have to be that complex. It can be as low maintenance as we want it to be. And honestly, if you're a low maintenance person, I would very much encourage you to have a low maintenance landscape, because if you're not going to be able to put the time and you don't really care to put the time into it, then there's no need to have an over the top landscape that's just going to look kind of wild and woolly if the time's not spent in it that it needs. Landscapes can lower your energy bills. A lot of times we talk about with landscape design is thinking about the future, thinking about the maturity of your plants. When you talked about right plant, right place, you probably talked about, thinking about where you're going to put those plants, how they're going to thrive, how they're going to do best. So when we think about long-term in the landscape, we want to think about mature sizes. And with that comes trees, things like shade trees. So a deciduous shade tree like an oak, a maple, can provide shade in the summertime, can lower energy bills on your house. And then in the wintertime, those leaves fall off and that lets the sunlight come through. And so that adds warmth to your house. So that's less heating and cooling bills. And if you've ever not had shade trees in your yard and your landscape, you know how hot and intense it can be in the summertime and you have nowhere to go. So landscapes can actually help lower energy bills. Of course, they address issues like hydrological issues and concerns, things like drainage, flooding, stormwater. I know y'all went through sustainability and environmental stewardship. And with that, we talk about things like rain gardens, which are a perfect option to add to a landscape for things like drainage issues or stormwater. Knowing where that water is moving, trying to move off site on your landscape and trying to capture it and keep it on site. Things like adding rain gardens or swells or berms, French drains, all of those can help with those issues that you might have. Or just properly planting slopes can help as well. And really with design, we don't have to do it all at once. A lot of times we think of it as, oh, I've got to do my entire landscape. And it becomes, again, daunting. That's a lot of time and money, especially put into it. But it can be done piece by piece. It can be done in phases. You think about it as like a blueprint for improving your yard. Map it out, do it by phases. I always recommend starting small because then you can kind of realize what you actually do like, what works for your landscape and what doesn't. Actual data that goes behind why design matters. They've been noticed or been studied a 15% increase in value to your home with a properly done landscape design. So with a proper, well-done design, a well-done landscape, it can increase your home by up to 15% in value. So on a $300,000 home, that adds up to $45,000 worth of just value. That's that street view, that drive-by aesthetic that the design can add to your home. And I didn't say this earlier. If you have any questions, you can put them in the chat box or just hold them to the end and I'm happy to answer them. So we talked a little bit about why we do design, and there's lots of reasons: aesthetics, value, mitigating problems that we may have in the landscape like drainage issues. But what is design? We talk about design. I always find it's a harder topic to talk about because it's so broad. And it also is so subjective. It's not a very objective thing. What people like changes from person to person. I always like to use the example of my mom. My mom, ever since I went through school, and I didn't really give my background, I have a degree in horticulture, 2 degrees in horticulture from Auburn University in Alabama. And one of those degrees is in landscape design. And so when I went through college, my mom was like, please, let's redesign my landscape. Let's redesign the house. And so we sat down and planned and started mapping things out. And it was very quick that we realized we had differing opinions of what a good landscape design was, what we liked. She likes very formal. I like very informal landscapes. She likes, the rounded boxwoods, and I like things wild and woolly. So with design, it is very subjective. So it can be a lot of different things. But some of the, more objective points is with design, one thing we're trying to do is manage the viewer's eye. So when you look at this picture here, where does your eye go? It can be in multiple places. To me, my eye goes to the door. Now there's also the water feature to the left there, but the door is where my eye goes to first. It's highlighted. It's not covered up. There's even a pathway to the door. A lot of times with designs, we are trying to lead people to our front door you may not be trying to lead people to your front door, so you may block that view. But a lot of times with design, we are trying to manage the viewer's eye. We're trying to take you somewhere. And so with this design, the way they've done it is they are highlighting that front door, making it open, welcome, easy to get to. They want people to come there, but they're also highlighting the water feature off to the side. So it becomes almost like not a folly, but almost like a specimen plant would be. It's a focal point that also manages your eye as well. So your eye kind of goes that way. Or maybe your eye hops to the fountain and then from the fountain to the door. So our view is not blocked. We are taken to that front door. And that's a lot of times what we're doing with design is moving you through the landscape, taking you to a certain point, or hoping that you look a certain direction and maybe covering up a view that we didn't like. Yes, and someone said stone. Yes, stone. I mean, we'll talk about hardscapes in a little bit, but yes, when my eye comes here, I see stone. They've taken the house, what was on the house, and they have mirrored that in the landscape with stone hardscaping. So here's the same house on the side. And with this part of the house, where does your eye go with this one? Just think about it. Take a look at the picture. Where do you think they were trying to get us to look? The fountain and the windows. Yes. So I look automatically at the fountain. And I think as the landscape matures, because this is a relatively new landscape, those plants in the back will get a little bit taller. I believe they wanted some privacy in that back area. And so windows and fountain, my eye goes straight to that fountain. That's where my eye stops. And that's what they wanted. With that fountain and the way they've mirrored those plants on either side, they want your focus to be right there and they want it to stop. A lot of times with design, we're very intentional about where we place materials like hardscapes or where we put specimen plants that show a lot of attention, because that's where the eye is going to usually stop. And so with this, they were very intentional. They left it open so you could see the fountain, your eye stops there, and it kind of makes you want to walk out to that fountain, see what's going on. It almost looks like a very secluded, interesting spot, and you can't see everything that's going on around there. And with design, a lot of times you're creating rooms. You're creating rooms within your landscape. And so this is one of those rooms. What design can do is make the most of what you've got. So in this top picture, you'll see their issue was they had a slope and they didn't really know what they wanted to do with it. They knew that they couldn't necessarily level it out. That wasn't an option. So what were they going to do with it to make it more aesthetically pleasing, to make it look good, to make it functional, because they wanted an outdoor entertaining area. They also had a little bit of water running off down towards the house. So what they ended up doing in that bottom picture is the after, and they ended up making a terraced planting bed. And in this terraced planting bed, they have some evergreens that'll eventually block that. Oh, sorry, my son's here. Oh, congratulations, good job. I gotta go talk, okay? Sorry about that. So we've got a terraced planting bed here with some evergreens that'll eventually block that view, which there was going to be some buildings enough going out behind that. And they put in a patio and a seating area. So this just makes it just more aesthetically pleasing. It fits with kind of the vibe of the house. They've got the stonework that kind of matches what they were doing with the house. It just, as you're looking from that before and after, it just seems like it was intentional. It seems like it was well planned out. And so what we do with design is we make the most of what we've got. Sometimes we can't change the giant slope in our yard, which if you saw my yard, you would be like, you and your husband are horticulturists and landscapers, because it doesn't look like it. Backyard, we've got a giant slope that eventually we hope to make a little bridge out to and put a little patio up at the top of the hill. But for now, it's just a big old hill in the back of our yard. And so we can't change that. That hill, we are on an easement. That's where the stormwater drains for our neighborhood. So there's not much we can do about the actual hill, but we can design the hill in a way that makes it of value, adds value to our home and our property. And it's not just, oh, this big hill that we have to weed eat because we can't get a mower up it. In this picture, what the issue was with this landscape, and we're making the most of what we got here. So this one had a slope. Nothing seemed to want to grow. They didn't really like it. They also wanted to add something that had a soothing sound. They wanted a water feature. They had, if you can kind of see to the far right of the picture, there's their patio. And so they wanted to add something that looked nice. They didn't really need the slope to be anything else other than a feature of some kind. And so what they did was they added this water feature. So it took the slope from just being a hill where not much would grow and water would just run off of, and they actually made it into a water feature that added to a little value in the back of their home. When people and guests came over, it was a really nice feature to look at as well as hear. And so taking that slope and turning it into something beneficial and something that they enjoyed, that was the whole design project here. So design can definitely help you turn a negative into a positive. A lot of times, as you'll see in these pictures, I get calls about slopes. And so what can I do with slopes? And so instead of just planting them, there are other things you can consider for sloped areas. Fixing issues like drainage or erosion. So with design and just being intentional about planting plants, because again, here you'll see they didn't alter any of the actual grading of the site. I don't know what in Montgomery County, but in Williamson County, a lot of times, and my husband can speak more on rules and regulations and all that, but regrading, and in most places, regrading can't be done a lot of times because of stormwater issues. And so in this one, we had an area that the water settled, and that was on purpose. They wanted the water to flow here and settle because in Williamson County and in Franklin, you're required to catch the first 2 inches of rainfall. So the first 2 inches you have to catch on site. It can't run off. And so they needed an area for that to catch and drain slowly and be filtered out. So what they did, and you'll see here, is bioretention. Now this is large scale. This is not your average everyday homeowner bioretention. Bioretention in a homeowner situation would look a little bit more like a rain garden or buffering along a stream or water body. But this is a larger scale. And what they did is they amended the soil so that it would drain well. And they added in a lot of plants that would help filter that water. Plants that wouldn't mind sitting in wet for a little bit at a time. Now, no plant is going to want to just be drowned. No plant is going to want to sit in wet for a long, long time. So if you have real severe drainage issues, you need to fix those instead of hoping the plants will fix those issues. So like with a rain garden, we're not just it's not a pond. It's not going to be a pond. We want it to have layers of organic matter and other materials that will help drain water and get that water down through our soil into the water table without it running off site and taking pollutants and other things to places we don't want them to go. I like to say it's kind of like what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. What happens in your yard, we want to stay in your yard, okay? We don't want it going off site. So with this bioretention, that's what they were doing. So they're taking a negative of stormwater runoff issues and turning it into positive using native plants, using plants that don't mind sitting in wet for a little bit so that that water has a chance to filter down, infiltrate through the soil, be filtered out. Any, residues or toxins or anything like that have a chance to be filtered out before they make it into streams and water bodies or into our water table. So this was at install, the top picture, and this is just 18. So just a year and a half later, a lot of those plants had grown in really well, and you can see the water settling here. They were doing their job. So we talked a little bit about what is design, how we can utilize design to help with issues we may see in the landscape. Now let's get into principles of design. So with principles of design, these are kind of like if you ever watched Pirates of the Caribbean. These are more guidelines, not hard, fast rules. So with this, we'll talk about some functional principles, things that'll help make your landscape a little more functional. And then we'll talk about aesthetic principles. So things that we consider when we talk about the visual part of our landscape design, how it looks, how it appears, how we see it, how others may see it. And with those principles, there's just one, well, besides the functional principles, there's just one rule that I consider to be like the utmost rule that if you do a design, one you can consider following. So we'll start with practical principles. Functionality, maintenance, and sustainability. We want to make sure, above all else, that our landscape is functional. Is it meeting the needs that we have? And we have a wonderful publication on landscape design from UT. It's Leveraging Your Landscape. And I don't know, Carla may have given it to you, or she may can send it to you, or you can find it online. It's on that uthort.com website. But Leveraging Your Landscape, and it has some great information on landscape design. It goes through some of what we're talking about, but it has a checklist of what you want out of your landscape. So you can kind of go through and check box those things like, am I going to have kids running around outside? Well, then I probably need somewhere easy for them to run around. I probably need to be avoiding poisonous plants or plants with thorns and sharp stickers. So thinking about that, or maybe I want to entertain. So is it meeting those functional principles? Is it working for me? Because if it's not working for you, then it's not a good design. Maintenance. When I went through design class, that was the first thing we talked about. Not drawing, not pretty pictures, not plants, but maintenance, maintenance, maintenance. Because if you do not have the means nor the opportunity to maintain it, it won't be maintained, and it'll be more of a headache for you in the long run. I again go back to my parents' landscape. When I was younger, they hired out a designer. He designed the landscape. They installed it, and it was a lot of plant material. Like, it was that instant, we all want that instant success, that instant design. And so they shoved plants on top of each other, left and right. So 10 years down the road, all those plants are overgrown. They're growing on top of each other. They're not happy. They're not healthy. And so this was a case of, that was a high maintenance landscape. That was an over application of plants. They should have considered, when they were doing the design, the maintenance, the long-term sustainability of that landscape. And then, of course, sustainability. We'll talk about having a sustainable landscape. You've talked about environmental sustainability, and it's those practices, those, soil health, plant health, environmental health that we want to make sure we're maintaining with our design. It's functionality, thinking about who is going to use this space and how are they going to use it? How will you move through this landscape? This picture is a great example of a landscape where they wanted to entertain. They wanted an oasis. They didn't want to have turf to maintain. They had a lot of shade anyways, and so the turf would have been hard to upkeep, and they wanted to entertain. So they turned their backyard into kind of a wooded oasis. They have a dry creek bed up front. Dry creek beds are great options if you have an area where water moves through, usually like when we get rainfall and things like that, but it's not a constant issue with water. It's more of a place. It's basically a way to guide water through your landscape by doing like a rock bed and making kind of a dip in that rock bed so that the water funnels and you're channeling it the way you want to. They use this a lot where storm drains and drain pipes come from buildings and come out. They'll have them come out onto a dry creek bed where that will then guide the water to where they want it to go. Behind that dry creek bed, you've got some stepping stones. You've got a patio area with some seating. There's a fire pit off to the right that you can't really see. And all throughout, there's stone material. So they're using that stone element, that wooded element, that pine straw to create an area where you can easily get to this, but it's not an area necessarily where you're going to, run around and play. It's more of an entertaining space. So that was the function they decided for this landscape. They decided we want an entertaining space, and the way they could achieve that was and have low maintenance entertaining space. This was the way they could achieve that. So thinking about how you're going to use your landscape. Again, are you going to have kids? Do you need some turf for your dog or kids or grandkids to run around on? Do you want to have a cutting garden? Are you really into cut flowers? Implement that into your design. Make sure you consider that. Where you have full sun is going to be where your vegetable garden is going to go usually. So making sure that you think about that when you're planning out your design. How are you going to function? How is this landscape going to work best for you? Maintenance. So thinking about long-term maintenance. Are you a low maintenance person or a high maintenance person? You may love to weed. I haven't yet met someone that's like their favorite thing in the world to do, but I have met people in my long career with extension and plant people. I have met people that love to weed because it's therapeutic, but that's not all of us. That's not usually the majority of us. So you may love to be in your landscape or you may not. Consider that when you do your design. How am I going to get to things? Am I going to easily be able to access my air conditioning unit? I don't know why. I don't know how it started, but a lot of people love to put pampas grass around their air conditioning unit. And if you've ever dealt with pampas grass, it is not fun. It's got sharp spines on it, the stems. It's big. It grows just enormously every year, it seems like. And so the poor people that have to get to those air conditioning units have to fight their way through it with a machete. So thinking about those things before you implement them, how are you going to get to a spigot? How are you going to access your drain pipes? You make sure everything, you can do maintenance on it. Considering those things, when you are doing the design, who's going to do the work? Are you going to be the one doing a lot of the maintenance, or are you going to hire it out? And that can help a lot with deciding where things are going to go, deciding how you're going to make that design. And then, of course, your budget. That's going to determine a lot of things as well. You can do, I have a landscape design friend, and one of her favorite things to do, she said, if you don't have any money in the world to do your design, is create bed lines. That can make your design, make your landscape look intentional. It's just having bed lines, not having your grass running over into your flower beds, just shovel edging a bed line or create beds where there were normally just one plant here and one plant here. We're creating a bed to connect those plants. Just doing that alone can make your design or make your landscape look more aesthetically pleasing. And the picture on top, you'll see the original design, and then on the bottom, the new. They did not like the stones. They were having trouble with Bermuda creeping. They were having trouble with getting to things. The storm drain was not draining right. They had plants that were dying because the plant material wasn't the right selection for that area. And surprisingly, they wanted a little more turf. That doesn't always happen, but they did. And so the way they were able to tweak this is to add a little bit of turf, take away that corner, that sharp hair, replace the plant materials with things that would do better in that area, and then just clean up those edges, clean up those bed lines, make that sidewalk a little straighter so that you don't have to make that curve when you're mowing. In this picture, you'll see our fabulous Jerry. He is a part-time employee, extension extraordinaire, and he is my great example of right plant, right place. So sustainability in the landscape can mean a lot of things. Sustainability is a term that's thrown around a lot, and it can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. I consider it something that we can easily maintain over time that does not have a negative effect on our local and global environment. So one of the ways we can do that is putting the right plant in the right place. That is sustainable long-term. That means putting a plant in and it's going to last. It's not something we're going to have to replace. And then we're going to have to go spend more money on a new plant. And that new plant came with soil that may have been sustainably harvested or not, shipping, which adds to the carbon footprint, et cetera, et cetera. So having the right plant in the right place can have that long-term, that longevity to that plant that we want in a landscape. Stress plants also equal more maintenance. When you have a plant that's not happy, it's more susceptible to disease, insect pests, climate events. And so you're going to be out there working on that plant, spraying that plant, pruning that plant more, eventually potentially digging up that plant and replacing it. So making sure you've got the right plant in the right spot. In this picture, we've got some euonymus. That's that scraggly, ugly looking plant around the air conditioning unit. And where Jerry is kneeling, there used to be two more. So it was really hard for whoever had to do maintenance on those air conditioning units to get out there. But in that picture, you'll see Jerry, and what he's doing is he is we are doing a test on the soil moisture levels. So we came out, first of all, these are not pruned correctly at all. When you prune a shrub, you want to make sure that the top part is narrower than the bottom part, because what happens is if the top part is wider, it shades out this bottom part, and then it starts getting sparse and leggy. And if you don't prune it correctly, all you get is tip growth like this and no middle growth. So this was also, this plant was a little bit stressed, but pruning not so great. But where these two plants had died, and I don't have the second picture for it, but you can see in Jerry's hand is soil, and you can tell it's dry, it's crumbly. Where that plant had died, it was really, really dry, even though, if you can tell in that picture here, we've got some drip irrigation. We've got some irrigation going on around here, really close to those plants. So it was really dry here, but where he's kneeling, another plant died, and it was sopping wet. I mean, we, not just 5 feet away, we pulled out soil that was sopping wet. And euonymus hate wet feet. They hate sitting in the wet. And it's hard to tell in this picture because it cut off, but there's a drain coming down from the roof that puts water out into this landscape. And so what we determined, and what you probably have assumed from this, is we were getting water from the roof in this one spot, as well as irrigation leaking, or not irrigation, sorry, the air conditioning unit condensating, that coming from the moisture coming from the air conditioning unit, as well as the moisture coming from the roof, were culminating in this one spot, which caused that plant to have root rot and die, and they had to pull it out. And not just a few feet away, it was bone dry, was not getting any irrigation whatsoever. So there were a couple of issues here. First of all, euonymus wasn't the best plant to put in around an air conditioning unit. You want something easy to get to. It was too close. And then they also didn't consider where their water was coming off their roof when they were planting these. You want to make sure that you're routing that water out to your turf or somewhere where there are plants that don't mind that extra moisture, but these plants just did not, and they were not happy. So they ended up having to replace most all of these in this area and put something back there that was a little happier. When thinking about sustainability, also think about your inputs, just time, money, tools, your blood, sweat, and tears. I've cried many times over a plant. I know we all have. But think about that, and thinking about plants last. And this may seem counterintuitive, because as plant people, as horticulturists, as master gardeners, we love plants. We're plant people. That's what we do. That's what we love. That's why we're here. But when we think of plants first, we often make mistakes on plant placement. If it was up to me, I would plant all the shade plants. Now, I love a good flowering perennial, don't get me wrong, but I love ferns, and I love hydrangeas, and I love hostas and all the shade plants, but I don't have a lick of shade at my house. Not one shade tree, not one shady spot. I think the corner of my front porch gets a tiny bit of shade for a couple hours in the day. Other than that, it's full-blown sun. Because I'm in a new development, and they didn't plant trees. They just cut down trees. So if I went with my instinct of planting things I liked, I could plant them, yes. But would they survive and thrive? Probably not. So when we think of design, we need to think of our sites first, our site specifics first, go through that process, and then plug in plants that do well. Plants come last. I know it's hard, but it's a good way to think about it so that you can have that long-term sustainability of plants in your landscape. All right. We're going to get into some aesthetic principles. So those were the practical principles. When we're being practical people, we need to think about sustainability, maintenance. We need to think about the functionality of our landscape. Now that we are done being practical, let's be a little crazy. Let's be a little creative. Let's be a little unique. When we talk about aesthetic principles, this is where you can put in your own flair, your own ideas. This is where you can go wild and crazy if you love it, or you can be very tame and formal if you like it that way. We're going to go through some of the aesthetic principles of design. These are, like I said, guidelines. You don't have to follow all of these. If you want to be weird, hey, you be weird. I'll be weird right there with you. But the overarching principle on this list is unity, and we'll talk about it first. But this is one thing. These principles aren't to tell you what you can and can't do necessarily. They're there to help guide your design. If you're stalling out, if you can't think of what to do next, you can look at these principles and they can give you ideas. They can help guide that design. And we'll go through each of these. So unity, this is what we think of when we think of tying the landscape together. That's what unity is. We're trying to tie one big landscape into a whole, okay? Lots of different parts. We may have different rooms, like I talked about, a backyard, a front yard, a side yard, a shed, a rain garden, whatever else. We may have all these different little parts of our landscape, and unity helps bring it all together. It is our overriding principle. When all else fails, go back to unity. And unity is achieved through repetition. And that's going to bring that unity to the design, whether it's repetition of colors, hardscapes, plant materials, bed lines, textures, forms of plants. All of that repeated elements can bring unity to a landscape. Using similar backgrounds and foregrounds. So having similar plant materials in the background of your landscape and in the front of your landscape. Somebody will drive up and they'll see, what they'll see with me is, Taylor likes purple because it's my favorite flower color. I love purple. So anytime I pick plants from a nursery, I'm automatically gravitating towards purple flowers. So when we put in part of our design, I chose different shades of purple. And I did purple in one part of our design of our landscape, and closer, which is further away from the house, and closer to the house, I put purple as well. And that unified them. Whether it was the same exact plants or not, I had purple from here, here, here. So visually, it was unified. It felt intentional, like I had planned it that way. So using similar backgrounds and foregrounds can help that establish those connections from one part of your landscape to another part of your landscape. Focal points. We talked about that fountain earlier. That's a focal point. It's going to establish dominance. It's going to make your eyes stop right there. That's where they want you to look. And that's going to add unity. It's going to make it feel intentional. It's going to make it not feel like you just threw something out there. It could be a fountain. It could be a toilet with some flowers in it. That's going to draw the eye. And that's going to establish that dominant focal point where our eye is going to go and bring that unity. So in this picture here, we have repeated plant elements, whether it's a line of false cypress or we've got some hollies in the back. We've got repeated elements that help that landscape feel unified. Here is the side view of that fountain I showed you earlier. So in this, what elements do you see repeated that make this feel unified? It doesn't have to be just plants. It can be other things as well. What do y'all think? You can type it in the chat box if you'd like. Are there any elements that stand out to you in this that make it feel unified? The bushes around the arch, yeah. Okay. Small boxwoods, repeated plant elements. Okay.
I had to unmute you to get to hear the answers from the class.
Oh, yeah.
What did y'all say? Rounded edges.
Yes. I love when people realize that one. symmetry on all sides? Someone said, yes, this is a very symmetrical landscape. We'll talk about symmetry in a second. But yes, the rounded is my first thing. I see round. When I look at this landscape design, I see round. The fountain's round. The circle that the fountain is within is round. The pathways are rounded off. The arch is rounded off. We have, right now, the shrubs are still growing in. They've got a new flush of growth on them. But eventually, they'll prune those to where they're slightly rounded as well. So that element of circular, rounded element unifies this, as well as the repeated plants, the small boxwoods all the way around, even the boxwoods in the background. Once the things are flowering, you'll be able to more starkly differentiate between those boxwoods in the back and the foreground. The hollies on either side. And then also I think of the hardscape materials used. You know, the stonework reflects the house. It ties it in. So that all those different elements go towards making this feel unified. Whereas it could have felt haphazard. It could have been, random plants here and there. That symmetry, like you talked about, and we'll talk about symmetry in a little bit, but that bisecting of that fountain on either side, it's repeated plant elements, and that's going to unify it as well. So that's unity. Just going back, that's unity. Unity is the overriding principle. If you don't do anything else, consider unity. Consider repeating elements, whether it's shapes, bed lines, specific plants, colors. I talked about textures. You'll see a mixture of fine and coarse leaf textures mixed within here, or maybe peeling barks or exfoliating barks or berries or something like that that's repeated throughout different parts of your landscape are going to help make a connection, help it feel unified. The next principles are simplicity and variety, and these bring harmony to a landscape. They need to work together. Too much of one or the other can be either really boring or really chaotic. So we need to have them work together. And repetition, like we talked about, can enhance both of those. So in this landscape, and really this one isn't that simple. Let's just say they had the same shrubs all across the front and no trees on the side. And all we have are just a row of the same shrub in front. It would feel a little bit monotonous, a little bit boring. And also from a sustainability aspect, we never really want to have just one of something. It's nice to have a diverse landscape. We don't want a monoculture. We want diversity in our landscape. But if we just looked at this house and it just had the same shrub in front of it and nothing else, no other elements, no other crazy curving bed lines or focal points or hardscapes, it would feel a little boring. We would maybe want to add in a little variety to spice it up. With variety, what we can do, we can often go too far and it can seem like we just threw up plants in the landscape, like we just threw them out there and they just decided to grow. But there's a controlled chaos with variety. So we can add pops of color and different colors. We can do warm palettes with pinks and reds and yellows and cool palettes with purples and blues and greens. And we can mix those and it can seem chaotic, but if we have that repetition, we have that unity, we have those repeated bed lines, those plant elements, forms, that can make variety seem a little less chaotic. And on the other hand, having repetition with simplicity, we can repeat those planting units, add more of them, add in a few more elements, and that can bring a little more fun to a very simple, boring landscape. So we want to have simplicity and variety. We want to have a good in the middle. Or, like I said, these are not hard, fast rules. If you love your house and your landscape to look like you just threw plants out there, or you have a botanical garden, hey, do it. Go for it. I'm not going to tell you you can't do that. But maybe consider a little bit of unity to make it feel cohesive. This is a good example of both. It's not too much. It's not a high maintenance landscape necessarily. but they've added in pops of color, perennials, different colored foliage, different textures with the grasses. They've added a focal point with the trees. And so all of that has given some interest to the landscape, but not enough, not too much that it's chaotic, and not too much that it's more than they wanted to handle maintenance wise. All right, on to proportion or scale. This is proportion and balance are two of the elements or principles that are a little harder to kind of grasp, so it's easier to look with pictures. With proportion, we're talking about scale as it relates to size. This is where large elements and the small elements need something in the middle to kind of break them up. So we don't just want turf and tree because there's nothing in between to break them up. Your eye just goes like right in between them. And also we don't want large, overly large plants in a very small landscape. You know, you've seen where trees have gotten more mature than people thought they would get. And there's an 80-foot tall tree in a tiny lot, and it just dwarfs the landscape. It even dwarfs the house. With proportion, we're trying to bring things back down to a human scale. It makes people feel more welcome when we have a proportional landscape. It doesn't feel, daunting, intimidating. And so it has those visual planes of something, everything fits in the landscape. Everything has a purpose. This is a picture, and it's really from the road. It's from this picture, it's harder to tell. But in this landscape, we've got trees that are just dominating the landscape. Large trees that are blocking the house from view. It just doesn't feel very proportional. We also don't have a lot of bed lines. We're missing some of that here. And so if we connected maybe those front 3 trees with a bed line, and that back tree is way too big to be that close to the house, it just feels very intimidating, like that tree might fall on the house at any moment. Also, this tree on the left here, I'm pointing with my finger as if y'all can see me. This tree on the left here is, if you're driving by, maybe blocking the view of the house. And, maybe that was their intention all along. They didn't want you to be able to see their house. They don't want to look at you, and they don't want you looking at them. But if I was trying to create that design where I'm managing the viewer's eye, I want it to go to the front door, I want it to highlight the landscape, I don't think these trees are serving that purpose. They feel out of proportion. They don't feel like they fit within this landscape. Balance, on the other hand, is where we're trying to visually weight the landscape. It's that visual weight. And we want to make sure we have that equal distribution of visual weight. This is where we get into asymmetrical and symmetrical landscapes. So with symmetrical landscapes, like we saw earlier, this is that same house. They like the symmetry. With symmetrical landscapes, what we're trying to do is we are trying to, it ends up lending itself to be more formal, more static, a very classical feel to it. With symmetrical landscapes, we have the same thing on either side of the central axis. So in this picture, our central axis is what? The door, right? That's where our eye goes. Hey, the design is doing what our intention was, is to go right to that door. They want us to come in. Now, like I said earlier, you may not want people coming into your house, but this person does. They're having an inviting front door where they want you to walk up. So on either side of that door, I have on this pathway the same plant materials. I have the same planting units. So it's very symmetrical. It's a very formal look. But it's an equal distribution of weight, visual weight. I don't feel like I'm lopsided and I'm leaning one way or the other. With an asymmetrical landscape design, it has a more casual feel. It's still an equal distribution on visual weight. So we're still don't feel off balance. We never want to feel off balance with a design or in a landscape, but it's going to have similar ideas on either side, but different elements. It's still going to be balanced, but different elements on either side. And this is going to be less formal. It's going to be more casual. It's going to have a little bit more movement to it. And sometimes a symmetrical structure is going to lend itself to a more symmetrical landscape, as well as an asymmetrical structure may be better to have an asymmetrical landscape. So this is a great example. Symmetrical structure. I mean, we've got the same gutters going, downspouts going down the side of this building, the same lights. We've got just a very symmetrical structure. So if I had done an asymmetrical landscape design, it wouldn't have been bad. But the symmetry of this design really highlights that symmetrical structure. And of course, our eye goes right to where they wanted it to, which is that giant, beautiful fireplace in the back. So here we have our central axis, which is that building as well as that fireplace. And on either side, we have the exact same planting unit. We have the same holly tree, the same shrubs, the same pots with even the same plant materials on either side. With symmetrical landscapes, some of the issues we can encounter are, let's say we lost one of those trees on either side, it would definitely feel more off balance. It's easier to feel off balance if we lose plant materials with a symmetrical landscape. It's almost like you're missing a tooth. Like you can see it, like it automatically just jumps out to you. Whereas an asymmetrical landscape, it's harder to kind of see those things because we've got different plant materials and different designs on either side. Whereas, and now we're looking beyond the pathway here for asymmetry in this one. So the pathway is symmetrical, but if you look on, this house is not a symmetrical house. This house is very asymmetrical. And if you look on either side, it doesn't necessarily feel off balance the way they've done the path with the planting unit to the right and then the planting unit to the left. So we've got focal points on either side. We've got, a few taller shrubs and trees on the left side over here, mixed in with some lower growing. So we're breaking up that visual plane, but we've got a larger planting unit here versus a smaller planting unit on this side. And so while the house is not symmetrical and the design is definitely not symmetrical, it doesn't necessarily feel like we're off balance. It doesn't feel like we're weighted too much on one side or the other. And so that's where this asymmetrical house can have an asymmetrical design and it not feel off-putting and it doesn't feel wrong. You may not like it, but visually it feels balanced. And we like to use the example of, in a design, we talk about the rules of 3, and that's part symmetry, part just visual balance in general. And that's where, in nature, things don't happen usually in even numbers. We don't see 2, 2, 2 of something. It's usually in odd numbers. And so when we put even numbers in the landscape, it can feel wrong. It can feel off balance. So you may have done this without even knowing you were doing it because naturally it just feels right to put 3 of something instead of 2 of something. Because if I put 2 of something, where does my eye automatically go? If I put 2 trees out in my landscape here and here, where does my eye go? Right in between them. It doesn't stop at those trees, which maybe that's my intention, like with this pathway, with that symmetrical landscape, they wanted the eye to go right in between them to that fireplace. But if I'm not trying to achieve that effect, if I just put 2 of something, my eye's going to go right through it. So I put 3, that's where my eye stops. Visually, I stop right there. So having that rules of 3, let's say we have on one side of the landscape, 1 large tree. Instead of putting another large tree on the other side, we could put 3 smaller trees. And that could make that visually balanced without having the same thing on either side. And then we'll talk about sequence and rhythm. So sequence, which is rhythm in the landscape, this is very much a supporting element. It's one that's definitely more subjective, harder to describe, but it's movement and interest and action in the landscape. So this is where we are breaking that visual plane and graduating plant sizes or textures or colors. So in this picture, we've got a ground cover, we've got a low growing, a medium, a taller plant, so that it has that movement. Or maybe we've got something shorter in the foreground and something larger in the background. So our eye moves to that background. It doesn't just get blocked by something larger and then we're missing the things behind it. It's that movement in the landscape. We are going to make it easier for the viewer to have a sense of composition of the landscape. So it's layering of the landscape. It helps your eye move from one place to another. Like we talked about at the very beginning, design is about managing the viewer's eye. Whether it's I love curving bed lines. That's one of my favorites. I love to curve bed lines. And so that's movement in the landscape. And what that does is it makes you want to move with it. It makes you want to see what's around that corner, walk through that landscape if that was your intention. The same thing can be said for using plant materials. We can use plant materials to have movement, to take your eye from one place to another. Follies are a great example. They use it a lot in English gardens and designs. Is they have something that interests you, that brings you to it, and then that's not the actual focal point. It's something beyond it. I kind of like the trick. They tricked you. But using those adds interest. It helps you move through the landscape. It creates a sense of whimsy and fun. So sequence can do the same thing. Is with sequence, we can achieve that movement, that interest in the landscape. Instead of having all of one thing at one height, we're going to graduate those sizes. Or textures. We have a fine texture up front, but a coarse texture in the back. A large leaf like a magnolia leaf in the back, but a smaller leaf like a holly or a boxwood up front. That adds interest. It adds movement. It doesn't just become one bland blob. It moves our eye through that landscape. All right. We are at the end of design principles. Are there any questions I can answer before we move to the design process?
Have any questions? Okay.
All right. I will wrangle up my husband and he's going to go through the design process. Let me go grab him real quick.
Okay. Do you want to take a 10-minute break at this point?
Oh, yeah. I remember you said at the hour y'all take a break. Let's take a little break and then I'll bring him in.
Okay. Sounds good.
All right. See y'all in a little bit.
Okay. Okay, are you guys ready to go again?
We are ready. Are y'all ready?
All right, we're ready. Thank you.
All right. So this is yeah, everybody's ready. This is my husband Drake. I'm kind of going in and out. That's this background. This is my husband Drake. He is a landscape architect in Franklin. He works for a company that does a lot of mixed use, commercial design. He does a lot of computer work, but as well as hand drawing and rendering. And he's going to go through the design process with y'all and kind of answer some questions you may have about what actually goes into the design process.
Yeah, so thanks for having me. I actually started out doing residential design. Spent the first few years of my career doing design build. We did a lot of outdoor kitchens and fireplaces and redo landscapes. And so I have a lot of experience in residential, which I like. But I did decide to move into something a little different as I got into the commercial aspect.
And I showed them some of the pictures. Those pictures you saw earlier. Carla's coming to tell us something.
Yep.
Is
Yes.
Drake not being loud enough?
Please, yeah, have him be a little bit louder, a little bit closer to the microphone. So
All
I've
right,
got my
Drake.
volume up on my speaker all the way. So.
Okay,
Thank
we'll
you.
tell Drake to be louder.
Okay, be loud. Use your outside voice.
So yes, we actually used some of your pictures in earlier ones. Those are the ones y'all saw with the fountain and all that. Those were some of Drake's residential designs that he had done.
Yeah, so I'll try to speak louder. Taylor is a lot better at that than I am, and speak clear. The first part that's really important when you're doing any sort of design is the base map stage. This is the stage where you get a lot of that information that can have domino effects on how your plan turns out. So in this stage, you want to make sure you show property lines, your house footprint, existing trees. This is basically a map of what's existing on your property or commercial site, whoever you may be helping out with along the way. It needs to be as accurate as possible, because if not, and I can tell you from experience, if it's not, when you get out in the field, it can sometimes cause some issues. So I try to tell people to be as accurate as possible. Not everyone can have a survey done or have someone come out there and locate different areas on their site. So, and as much as it is, as we're working through these, to make sure that you're signifying where the windows are and stuff like that. So another important part to put on there is utilities, because that affects a lot of our landscape, what we can put in utility easements or drainage easements, or maybe what we put in our front setback. Those are all important things to have on this base map. And so this is kind of the catch-all for basically what's existing on your site as it stands today. Surveys, of course, make it a lot easier. If you can do a survey, I would say do that 9 times out of 10, because it's a lot more accurate, and you're going to have a better design because of it. However, I understand that that's not feasible for most residential designs, or if you're helping a friend out, they're probably not going to go get a survey. One thing I tell people, though, is when you buy your house, a lot of times it comes with a plot plan, or if you live in a neighborhood, they have a plot plan, and you can use those a lot of times. So important things on here is the scale. So your base map needs to show what scale it is. I tell people to use the
architect scale or the engineer scale.
Yes.
Have y'all ever seen that? It's like a triangle almost. And it's got like a bunch of different measurements on either side.
Yeah. And sometimes easier is just to use graph paper and use each one of the squares as a foot. That's a pretty accurate way. You don't have to use a scale, but using a scale, you can go between a lot of different sizes of plants. And then knowing where north is, because it will come back to help when you start laying out your plants design.
And you can see on this picture here, you can see the scale on the top right where it tells you, 1 inch is equal to 20 feet. So you know that, because we have to scale it down sometimes. And I always forget, Drake, it's the the smaller the scale, the more zoomed in we are, or is it the larger the scale, the more zoomed in we are?
Larger the scale, the more zoomed in you are.
Yes. So like that would be like 1 inch is equal to
100 feet.
100 feet. So
Super zoomed.
super zoomed in. And so you
zoomed out.
zoomed
Sorry.
out. Sorry, super zoomed out. See, it's confusing. So you can zoom into a landscape by changing your scale. So you could do a very small scale area and easily use the actual scale to delineate that that is a small area and put more plants in there.
The next part is one of my favorite parts because a lot of times it is the part where we get to go to the site when we have the opportunity, and this is for site analysis. During this process, it's really just about getting some of these elements of your site that you can't necessarily quantify with the base map. These are things such as areas that feel good to hang out in, areas that like in the morning when you're drinking your cup of coffee, there's this certain spot in the backyard where it's shaded from the trees and it's like the most beautiful area and the temperature's perfect. Those are things that you won't necessarily quantify on a base map, but a site analysis is where you would put that. It's important because it can help inform your design later on. And so this is an example of one we did where I just walked around with the client and wrote down things that he wanted to highlight / incorporate into the design. And that's important because whoever's yard it is or site it is, they're going to be the most familiar. Like if I came to your house to do design, you're going to be most familiar with your house, what goes on there. Some of these features that even if I spent 2 hours out there, I would never be able to understand fully. So we went through and talked about location, how he wanted to access the site, where he was having water issues, how he wanted to create a secluded space because he had a neighbor that was there and he wanted to plant some plants to kind of hide that a little bit, where he wanted his patio. These were all things that we incorporate into the site analysis, where the sun was hitting, which kind of the transition between the backyard, the back patio, and then the actual yard and to his fence. So good things to put in there. Sun versus shade, because you'll need that for your planting design a lot of times. Which way's north, of course. Wind exposure. So if there's an area that's exposed more to the wind or it's more protected, that can come in handy when you start talking about plants that are a little more sensitive to our area or maybe on the borderline of our USDA area. And so if they're protected, they may do a little bit better than if they're fully exposed. Views are another important one. So if you're talking about views like your backyard or views of an awesome site that you want to see, or you have this really cool tree that your great-great-grandmother planted, those are all things you want to put on here that you want to highlight. Drainage is another big one because drainage can impact not only you, but your neighbors. And a lot of times I've seen in my career where people don't think about drainage until the very end. And then usually it's too late to really fix some of the problems and you have to tear up a lot of things. So, and then areas of interest, and this can be anything. This is kind of those ephemeral qualities or these kind of qualities that maybe you wouldn't necessarily get located on a survey, but that you really do want to highlight in your design.
Yeah, and with site analysis, I always like to think of it as this is where we're planning for that right plant, right place. So if we're thinking at it from a horticulture aspect, this is where we are like, hey, this is a drainage issue. I'm not putting any euonymus there because I know that's the problem for them. Or this is an area I want to block. So I'm looking at evergreen plants eventually. Now I'm not picking out specific evergreen, but I know I'm going to need something that's going to block it, whether it's a structure or a plant. So this is an important step in the process, definitely a key step in the process for you to have that more sustainable landscape and functional. We talked about practical principles. And so one of those practical principles is functionality. How are they going to use the landscape? And if it doesn't work for them, then it's not a good design. And this is kind of that part of the process.
It also helps your designs feel like they responding to specific parts of the site rather than someone taking a design and kind of dropping it down on top of your backyard. So when you can highlight these points or these uniqueness of each individual yard, it really starts feeling like your yard was catered to your site instead of kind of the other way around.
Like cookie cutter, like
Yeah.
we did the same thing at every house, no matter what.
Exactly. The next part is also really fun. It's
This is my favorite.
conceptual design. A lot of times people get nervous because this is the part where people think they need to be able to draw really well or be able to really sketch things out really quickly. It's different levels. It can mean a lot of different things. Conceptual is a very broad category. And this is just an example of a quick one I did. Same site that we just looked at from the site analysis, trying to highlight some of those things. And I actually took the site analysis, put this on top of it and drew. So you can see some of the areas, some of the bubbles that were from the site analysis, how they've actually come into play in some of the design elements. So this is the part where we try to focus on the big ideas. We want to hit those. We want to make sure we're kind of getting, working through some of our ideas, but not committing necessarily to certain square footages or exact details or plant species or any of those things that may come later, that will come later on in the design process. So we can say, hey, we want the butterfly garden in this area. We don't necessarily need to get into, okay, inside this garden, we want this. And a lot of times I found with master gardeners, that's the time where people like to really dig in deep, like if I'm gonna do a butterfly garden, then I want this plant, and don't worry, that'll come later, and that's great. But we have to sometimes get through this conceptual part to kind of get everything located, and then we get into the details of it.
Yeah, we talked about plants come last.
Yeah.
It's hard, but it's part of the process.
The other thing we look at is your wants versus your needs, and you're not always going to fit everything you want in a landscape. A lot of people have a 10-year landscape plan. And I say landscape, but it's just a conceptual plan of their yard. You know, I'm sure each one of you have I want this patio and I want a fireplace and I want a pergola over the top of it. It's not going to happen overnight, and it's going to usually take a long time. Sometimes we get it done real quick and it's beautiful. We get to go right in and have that kind of bam, immediate effect, but oftentimes it's done over time. And so knowing what you want up front, what you need up front, what's the most important. And so part of that conceptual design is thinking through, okay, if I can only do this in phases, what can I do now that it won't look half finished or like there's something more coming later? Those are all important things to think about through this conceptual phase. And I tell people do 2 or 3, at least 2 or 3, could do more. Because what happens is a lot of times we'll get in our head that we want this certain, like we've seen the site, I already know what it needs to look like, I already know the design it needs to be. Well, a lot of times we can't think differently about it until we get that one down on paper. So once we get that one on paper, we then can open up our minds, usually, for me anyway, this works, to new ideas, concepts, thoughts that maybe we wouldn't have thought about before. This is also a good time to get, if you have a client feedback, or if it's a friend feedback, because there's enough here, like on this one, there's enough here you could talk through some of the elements. Like, do you like this access? Do you like how the path winds through the property? Is this patio big enough, large enough? Does it kind of fit your needs? Those are things you can talk through this conceptual level, and you haven't put a lot of time and effort into it, so it doesn't feel like it's not anything that could be changed. So I think that's an important mindset to have during this phase. And it doesn't have to be pretty. It can just kind of be sketchy. It can be just for you. You may never show it to anybody else, but it is an important part, and it is really helpful. And it's really fun because you don't have your circle template out.
Low commitment.
Yeah, you're just drawing things in and letting the creative juices flow.
This is my favorite part of the design process because I have commitment troubles and I am also very indecisive. So this lets me be as indecisive as I want. I can just create bubbles. I mean, that's all Drake said. I mean, this is his that he's done that you see here on the screen. And he said, this is a quick one he did. He's more skilled than I am. My quick one would look nothing like this. It would be the base map with a bunch of bubbles on it. And that's perfectly fine. That's all it has to be is I want a vegetable garden here. There's full sun, bubble. Oh, there's that view we want to block. here's a great planting bed of evergreens bubble. And it can just be little bubbles here and there. And I like how Drake said, it's a way to get it down on paper because it's always going to be in the back of your mind what you thought. And you can get it on paper, look at it, and say, oh, yes, this is what I want. Or we can step back and say, well, maybe I should consider some other things. Let's do another one. Tweak it, move some things around. And so it lets you be creative. It lets you try different things. And it's low commitment. You don't have to do what you put on paper. And it doesn't have to be very particular or specific or very detailed. It can be as abstract as you want. And it can be your final design.
Yes.
Like for me, just getting it on paper really helps me think through the process. And I don't necessarily have to go to the final step of design, which is a lot more intensive of a process. So this could be where you end it. This could be where you say, I've got it. This is my inspiration. I've got it laid out. I don't really worry about the square footage or any of that. I'm going to go from here and start my design.
Yeah. And if you're building it, you can build from this. You can go move plants around. You can lay out, paint out like a patio space. Like you can do it from this. And that's where you can be accurate. Like, okay, I need this many plants because I put these out here and moved them around. I love doing that. That was great because no matter how accurate or well you feel like you've drawn it, once you get into the field, once you start installing or putting it in, it's going to change. It always does. And that's okay. That's the other part. We don't want to be too married to our ideas. And so you can take this and say, I basically know there's going to be a landscape bed. I want to stay this far off the house to have proper planting techniques. There's these different elements that I want to do. And once you start narrowing it down, you can take this and build. And you can even build from bubbles, like Taylor said. It's pretty intuitive once you get out there sometimes. And
you can take some string out there and string out some bed lines and just look at it. If you're a visual person and pen and paper just doesn't cut it, you can go out in your landscape, take some string, some like bright colored string, or some people use spray paint. I'm a little messy, so I like the string, but you can string it out and just look at it and see, okay, yes, that was what I wanted to do. That is kind of like a conceptual design, just not on paper.
Yeah, and they're at Lowe's and stuff, you can buy that orange marking paint or white marking paint that washes off real easy. And flags, that's another thing you can do is put flags in the ground. We used to do that a lot when we did design build because a lot of times we would take this and draw it in the field with real measurements and show the client, and you could actually stand on the patio and imagine it in your head in more of a 3D way than a lot of people can reading the plans. But if you do want to take it to the final design, that's also a broad stage that can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. This was a final design that I would say is probably more like halfway between a final design and a conceptual design. It's still very sketchy. We put some color on there just because it made it easier to explain to the client. But it's still really sketchy, but this one actually have plants specified. It has plants drawn to the correct scale. And so there's a lot of those elements that are included in the final design. This is where the details matter. This is where you get a lot of times your takeoffs for your hardscape, like walls or sidewalks or patios. So if you're, drawing something for a friend or a client or someone who's asked you when they found out you're a designer now, which you will get asked all the time. But this is the point they want to know, right? Someone who, if you get a quote on installing landscape, they want to know plants, they want to know how much square footage of pavers or concrete or whatever else that is included in the design. So this is a lot of times where you specify your hardscape materials. So if you want to do pavers or stamped concrete or colored concrete or gravel, those are all things to specify in this final design space, the final design stage. Also to include your custom details. So when you custom fit anything to a landscape, sometimes you need a little bit of a custom detailing to be able to achieve what you want to. So whether that's how you lay out your pavers, how the wall looks, how the stepping stones are. We found ourselves a lot of times having to specify how far apart stepping stones are, because a lot of people put stepping stones really far apart. And so they become like skipping stones instead of stepping stones. You probably have experienced that before, where you go out to walk on someone, you're having to like jump from one to the other. And so those are things that matter and are important to specify. So we did a lot of detailing on how far apart the stones need to be to make it a comfortable walking surface. Bidding and estimating is an important part. If you're doing it all yourself, a lot of times you can build it from the conceptual stage because the takeoffs aren't as important.
What is a takeoff?
Takeoff are basically your square footages of materials or quantity of materials. When I was doing residential design, we would bid and estimate. So we would have to estimate how many yards of topsoil and how many yards of mulch and how many square footage of pavers, all those types of things, soil amendment for existing beds, square yards of sod. Those are all things that you may, a lot of times when you get a bid, you'll need to know. So having accurate design helps with that. And then having an accurate base maps allows your takeoffs to be more accurate, which allows your estimate to be more accurate, which in turn, I think makes everyone a little bit happier rather than it going the opposite way. Plant species, quantities, those are things too to include in there. This is the time to be specific. This is where you get to pick your plants and say, I want this variety of butterfly bush here, or, I want emerald green arborvitaes, or whatever your plants are that you're picking. This is the time to be specific, because this is what usually a contractor will take out there to be able to build from. And it should be able to stand on its own so that you could hand it to anybody and they could be able to put it in accurately to how you have it envisioned in your head to the plan. So that's the most important thing, is it needs to be accurate enough that without you standing over someone's shoulder and explaining your design to them, they can get it installed in a way that fits what the original intent of the design was. So a lot of times is where planting instructions come in. I think it's important whenever we can to specify planting instructions, and just reason being that if you have someone doing it that does it a lot, they probably know, but it's always good to, sometimes the industry standard's not always the correct way. But if someone's helping you, being able to point to a detail or an explanation of how you should plant. I know UT has a lot of examples of publications of this is how we need to plant it, so you can kind of give them a run through real quick before you start the process. So it's important though. The final design being accurate. If you hear anything from this slide, is being as accurate and specific as possible is important to the final layout. And most people, like I said, never get to this stage, or if they do, it's even further along. Like it could be a black and white CAD drawing. It could be with engineered detailed drawings. Most of the stuff we do now is 40 or 50 page sets of final design that's construction details, and which can be complex and
It can
complicated.
take a long time
Yeah.
to put together. It doesn't just happen in a day.
Yeah.
So if you're on a time crunch, a final design may not be for you.
Yeah.
And it doesn't, it's not that it's not flexible, but if it's just you doing it, there may not be a need unless you just enjoy the process to do a final design. If you really enjoy the design process and you want to get like you said, the templates out and be very specific with scaling your plants, this is where those plants are to scale. So that green giant arborvitae that you see up here in the top is to scale. So they know how many to put in that space. So this is where you're very, very specific. It's just a very specific part of the process where you have plant lists by cultivar. And so it's not just a perennial or an evergreen. We're saying this is a green giant arborvitae. That's the one I want. So it's a very detailed process, and it may be something that you never take your design to, or it may be something that once you've got your conceptual down, you go to a professional and have them draw up a final design for you.
Yeah. And to speak on the size of the plants, I know you all probably know very well about when you lay out plants in a landscape, you want to make sure you're planning for that mature age and width, and not the size it's going to be now. A lot of these plants that were put in, like the green giant arborvitaes in the back in this area, they may be put in as 5 foot tall at this time, and they're going to look a little sparse right now. But I recently went back to this property not too long ago, and in 5 years they've grown in, and they're basically a wall, and they're connected basically how they're drawn here. So that's important because we see a lot of times people want that immediate effect, and so they'll plant everything really close together. And then Taylor gets a call in 2 years, like, my landscape's dying. There's not enough airflow. They're getting funguses. They're crowding out, and we have this in the front of our house where we have plants crowding out other plants. And it's just, it wasn't designed for that kind of mature age. It was designed for immediate pop. And so I think that's important to include in the final design, is that design for that final maturity of your plants.
Yep. And we actually talked about that when we talked about practical principles. We talked about thinking about maturity of a plant and how that would go towards longevity in the landscape and not just piling everything on top of each other. And I also told them about my mom's landscape where we ended up ripping out half the plants because it was overplanted. No one thought about maturity.
And this is just an example of a detail that we were trying to explain to the client. This is an additional structure with a fireplace. He had a retaining wall, pretty bad slope that basically had water stand 5 feet off the back of his house, and he wanted a more usable yard. So we went together, put this detail about how this wall would work with this fence and how we could create a more level surface, more usable backyard by creating that retaining wall, and then how we could plan it so that it would feel less like just a wall with plants on top of it.
And we actually saw the final product of that. We saw the picture where they had that retaining wall and those evergreens and that entertaining area. And so this is what it would have looked like in that final design drawing.
And this is an example of this piece right here. This is like phase 2. So it's longer term. They built the patio, but the structure in the fire pit or fireplace and all those pieces are for a later time, but they wanted to go ahead and have that usable part of the yard because that was, for them, an important part of phase 1. That was a need for phase 1, is a more usable backyard. And so that's really put their money at for the first part. And then knowing that later they want to come back and add the covered structure.
And we talked about phases, and you don't have to do it all at once, especially budget wise, time wise. You can do it in phases. So this is a good example where phase 1 was the most immediate needs, and then the other needs could be met later on.
Yep.
And you had a question. Have you done any designs with focus on seasonal color for trees or bushes?
I have done a few designs. I'm going to be honest with you. I like, for every design and as much as possible, to focus on seasonal color for trees and bushes. I like to try, because my undergrad's in horticulture, so I'm a plant nerd at heart. I did go on to get landscape architecture, but I did get a degree in horticulture, and I love plants, grew up in a nursery. I feel like the most successful landscapes are ones that look great in the spring, the summer, the winter. And when every time someone goes to a site at a different time of year, they can experience that landscape in a different way. So I agree, seasonal color is great, is important. I think using different colors, plants that are shown year round is important. I think playing off the fall color with maybe an evergreen that's maybe a chartreuse color is important. And then adding those beds for that seasonal color or pots for seasonal color. But I do really like and enjoy using trees and bushes as color, because I think that is something people don't focus on a lot anymore. I think people think of color as like flowers, and you can do a lot with trees and shrubs to get that year-round interest that doesn't have the maintenance of, annual flowers every year.
And annual flowers are great, but they are high maintenance. I mean, you're pulling those and replacing them every year. So adding elements of interest, seasonal interest, when they're permanent, like trees and shrubs and perennials, can really enhance your landscape and be lower maintenance options.
Yeah.
And it's something like doing a bloom calendar, driving around seasonally and seeing what's in bloom, what's of interest. what has color now, or maybe it's considering things like oak leaf hydrangeas and grasses that in the winter, they don't actually really have much going on leaf wise, flower wise, but they have really cool structure and peeling bark and things like that. So seasonal interest is super important, layering your landscape and thinking of something of each season. I'll let Drake go. My son's calling us.
This is an example of, like I was talking about before, a final design that was done in AutoCAD program. So you can see it's a lot more detailed, a lot more structured than the previous final design. Has the north area, the scale. And this was the landscape that had the fountain, I think, that y'all looked at previously, which is this back courtyard area. So this one, because we were doing part of the install, we had to take it to that next level to ensure that the landscape and the hardscape and the grading and all those pieces got installed the way that we had envisioned them in the original concept plan. So this is super detailed. A lot of times you won't get to this level or need to get to this level, but it is another example of how far a final design can go from this one to this one. It's a very wide range, and so it means a lot of things to a lot of different people. And I think if you can build and construct what you're looking at off of this, then you may not need this, and probably very rarely would you need this, but just to give you an example of one.
And this would be something you would use in the job you're in now all the time, because you hardly ever really meet with the clientele other than that initial meeting, and you just send off designs, right? You kind of send and you go back and forth.
Yeah.
And this is a great way to get those details in.
Because I'm usually not there to explain my design. This one I can explain a little bit more, like these are stepping stones, and this is a paver patio, and this is stepping stones that like kind of fade off into the grass, and this is a water feature. Everything's not spelled out exactly, and I walk through this one with the client. This one, everything's spelled out. It has a water feature, it has the type of pavers. This is the landscape plan. We actually had a hardscape version, which was a mirror of this, that talked about the type of paving that goes into the concrete and the bands we wanted and how far apart these bands were supposed to be and all the elements of the hardscape, so that I could hand it off to the person doing the construction and they could build it as we envisioned and discussed with the client. The next thing we'll do is talk about resources, because I get asked this question a lot, and I think Taylor does too, about what can I do? Like, I don't have AutoCAD, I don't have any of these programs. How can I design, or are there other options out there for people to use? And just some great resources. Google Earth is an awesome resource. It's free. You can zoom into most of your properties and look at things such as existing trees and where the house sits. A lot of times you can determine where the property line is based on fences and things like that. But it's a good one to keep an eye out for, like existing pieces. The other thing it can be used, it has a time feature where we can go back in time, and you can actually very often see where there's water, because it takes the different times of year. You can see like, oh, there may be a water issue here because it's a discoloration versus another area. So it's a really good tool when you know what to look out for. And if you're just kind of exploring, like, what does my property look like? Or you can print it off directly from there and go to your conceptual planning and draw bubbles and a lot of times get to where you need to be without really diving into some of the other pieces. The other thing is GIS maps. A lot of counties have them. I actually pulled up.
One second, I'm gonna pull it up for y'all. All right, are y'all seeing that?
This is an example of GIS map for Clarksville and Montgomery County. This is the FEMA flood map, GIS map, and it's really good if you want to look at if your house is in the flood zone or such things as that. So you can zoom in, look at parcels. This, you can see, has parcel lines on there. So a lot of times you can get a basic approximation of where property lines are if you look at these houses. So it can be a very helpful tool to kind of understand where property lines follow on the site. So GIS is a good one. The other one that people ask about a lot is the zoning map. This is the zoning map for Clarksville, Montgomery County. So if you're wondering where you're zoned at and where you fall under within the city, you can look on here and go to the zoning ordinance and look at what your property is zoned for. So they have a lot of maps that, and once again, it has often property lines that you're able to use, and you can turn this into what do you call it? Google Earth, and turn off zoning, and you can see those property lines as well. This is a great tool. Like I said, when you're exploring, it's often very hard to take this and get a scaled map out of it. That's the difficult part. But for conceptual drawing, when you're, if you print this out at 8.5 by 11 and you're just exploring the site, oftentimes you can.
No. That's the Zoom.
I know, that's what I'm trying to do.
You're trying to do.
Annotate. Sorry. I'm just picking a random property in there.
No.
Okay.
That's what I was trying to do.
Oh, anyway, you could print this out and say, here's a tree canopy, and I know that the sun goes this way, so it's probably pretty sunny on this side. Like, you can start printing that out and walking around your property and getting some ideas of that. So those are some good options that I feel like are helpful for homeowners to know about, and they're all free options. Most of the other things that you have when it comes to design programs do cost something. But I tell people too, it's really important to find designers you like. Do some research, look at Southern Living, or ASLA is a good one. That's the American Society of Landscape Architects. They have a whole section that's residential design. You can just see pictures of some designs people have done. And a lot of times that can inspire you or make you think about something in a different way. And so that's helpful. I follow Monrovia, Southern Living Plants, all those
Proven winners.
Mm-hmm. Not necessarily for plant ideas, but just to see like what's out there. Sometimes they'll post pictures of plants located in the landscape, and I'll say, oh, that worked out really well. Or, oh, that one was probably not the best.
Is it Monrovia that does some really good ones?
I think so.
Monrovia does some really, if you don't follow them on Instagram, if you have Instagram, Monrovia Plants, they'll every once in a while do like a themed garden, and they'll tell you what each plant is and the pops of color in this. It's really neat.
And those are helpful because, like I said, you could take your conceptual design, take this idea that you got from these photos, lay it out there on site, and boom, you have a design that functions and fits to your site, and is very helpful. This picture is one where we printed out a base map to scale, sketched it out. That's the scale up there at the top. If you recognize, this is the engineer scale, but we were drawing on an accurate base map, trying to get an understanding of how the site works and lays out, adding pops of color. This is kind of the conceptual phase of the process. UT Hort has a lot of good connection pieces, bloom calendars, perennials that do well in Tennessee, all those things. Those are all very helpful. Flower colors on blooms. Using those elements are really great too. Books, of course.
I've got some books down here.
This book
right here is probably one. Let's see if we can get it up. I'll send it to you. Let me see. Well, you guys, it's going to be like hovering. You can't see it. Okay. It's there you go. This is a book called The Southern Gardener's Book of Lists. So it's a book of literal lists. That's what it is. And it's every designer probably has this book or at one point had it. It's no longer in print, I don't believe, but you can find it on Amazon. But this book is by Lois Trigg Chaplin. She used to work for Southern Living. And it basically just gives you lists of plants that do well in certain spots in the landscape. So like you could flick through, and Drake just opened it up, and
it's like surprising irises that rebloom or hostas that thrive in the lower south.
Or let's see, annuals that don't withstand a pounding rain. I mean, these are some very abstract concepts, but they give lists of plants for. And so this was actually the first book that our design professor told us to buy, was the Southern Gardener's Book of Lists. And it's got lots of great stuff. Now, I will say, grain of salt with this one. There are some recommendations in here since it is an older book. Probably, I think the last time it was redone was in the early 2000s. There are some recommendations in here like Bradford pear and Leland cypress, which we do not recommend because of their invasive properties or how look. Yeah, this one's 1994. So there are some recommendations in here that we do not recommend anymore. So take it with a grain of salt. But it's a great book to just spark ideas.
Yeah.
And get ideas. So I think one of them is like acid loving plants for the shade, or it's just lots of different lists that you can go off of. That's one of the ones I've got. Another favorite of mine is Proven Plants for Southern Gardens. And I'll send Carla a list of these so she can send it to y'all. But it's got pretty pictures. I'll have Drake hold it up so you can actually see it. So it's got pretty pictures. And it goes through plants and the plants that do specifically well in the South. So this is a great one. And then we've got another one. Let's see. Not that one. Southern Gardener's Handbook. This is a great one. It's for Alabama, Arkansas, Georgia, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Tennessee. But it goes through plants, but it also gives you so much information on them. Not just sunshade, but size, water needs, care, problems, etc. That's a great one. And then the one at the bottom, those last two. This is a really good one by Harvey Cotton. He was the director at the Huntsville Botanical Gardens and a few other people. But the one thing I love about this one is at the top of the page, Drake, show it off for them. You can see up here, they've got deer resistant, or attracts hummingbirds, or attracts butterflies, average weeks of color, 27 weeks. So this has a lot of great information for like wildlife uses. And this is Easy Gardens for the South. And then this one's Timeless Landscape Design. This is a great one if you really want to get into design. It talks about making a design plan. It goes through the different processes of design. It gives you ideas on design and talks about scale and other things. So these are just some great tools to use. I'm a big book nerd. And then, of course, your extension agent, you've got Carla there. She can give you great advice. She's an arborist. She knows her trees really well as her other plants. So you can also use your extension agent. And then I always like to, if you're in a neighborhood or in your area and you're driving around or walking around, look at what other people are doing that you like. And maybe talk to them and see either who their designer was or why they chose the plants they did, or, take pieces from what's doing well in your area. Other resources, of course, on uthort.com, we have things like annuals and biennials for Tennessee or perennials for Tennessee, and that goes towards that right plant, right place. They've got some, and you probably talked about these when you talked about herbaceous plants, charts for those plants. There's perennials. Perennials are one of my favorite things to add to a landscape. When I'm doing a design or considering a landscape, they may not be the bones of my landscape necessarily, but you know how you have the thriller, the filler, the spiller? They're definitely a lot of my filler in the landscape because they come back every year. You have that sense of permanence with them, and they add interest and color. They provide for wildlife. We have a lot of wonderful native perennials. If you're really into native landscape plants, we have a lot of great native perennials and native shrubs that do really well in our landscapes that you can add. So I love perennials. I know you like perennials as well.
Yeah, I think they're really an easy way to take an existing landscape and take it up a notch. You can add lots of layers, like a phlox that's really low, and then maybe 2 or 3 layers worth of perennials that really can take a standard, maybe just evergreen shrub with a few things in front of it and make it feel like it's more impactful. So that's why I like them, is they're really easy way to like patch things. Or if you really don't like your landscape, you can throw in some perennials and it can really make your garden come alive and address some of what people like to say is like dullness. Like, we want pops of color. This is a great way to do it. Texture, color. They're easy ways to incorporate all those things into your landscape easily and lower maintenance than an annual.
Yes. Not that we are bashing annuals. I love annuals. They have a place. I love to put a pot in an area of the landscape that just won't grow anything. Sometimes you have really shady spots or really dry spots or spots where things just won't grow. And there's nothing that says you can't put a container there, a really interesting container, and put annuals in it and add interest that way instead of putting a physical plant in the ground. So annuals do serve a purpose. It's just they're a little more high maintenance and expensive.
Yeah.
We have a great publication, Screen Plants for Tennessee, of course. That's our evergreens for Tennessee landscape. So this is where you can get that screen that you wanted, privacy hedge, and you can go through here and look at the different screen evergreen plants that do well in Tennessee, not just Leland cypress, which do not do well. This picture's a little fuzzy, but the Tennessee Invasive Plant Council. So that would be, their website is TNIPC, yes, TNIPC.com. Tennessee Invasive Plants Council has some great publications on landscaping with natives. So this is one for Middle Tennessee. They have one for West and East Tennessee. And they give specific native plant recommendations for that area in Tennessee. So trees, shrubs, vines, flowers, ground covers. They'll give you a list of native plants that do well. They also have a great publication on alternatives for invasives. So let's say you have an invasive plant in your landscape, like English ivy, or you've got Chinese privet or something like that. They will give you a replacement for that. So something that looks similar, but isn't an invasive threat, invasive species. So,
and their list is hyper specific, which is great because a lot of times we see native plants like this is native to the eastern United States, and theirs are really specific to our area of Tennessee, and they've taken a lot of time and effort to make sure that they've kind of filtered through those, and it's great. They also use, I think they have like whether or not it likes xeric or dry
yes.
or wet soil.
They have whether it likes dry, medium, or wet soils, or all three, sun and shade. So they'll tell you that as well.
Which is helpful if you're looking for plants for like a rain garden or a low spot or a tough spot that can't seem to get anything else to grow in. It can be helpful in there.
And speaking of, we have a new publication on rain gardens for Tennessee. And you can find that on uthort.com. And it's got a list of rain garden plants and where they fall within the rain garden. All right. Any questions for Drake before he hops off?
I'm unmuted here. We got at least one question.
So, it's all about do your design and pick your plants by variety, but what's you do when you can't find?
Where do you find substitutions?
What was the question? We couldn't hear it, Carla.
When you're doing a design and you put in something specific that either you or the homeowner wants, what do you do when you can't find that specific plant?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to understand when you're doing, that's why it's important to know the qualities that you're trying to look for before you pick the plant, because then it's really easy to sell a plant. So if you're looking at, like we were talking about in the conceptual point of, I want a native grass that's going to help hide my AC unit. Well,
Don't do pampas grass.
that's qualities that if I don't, pink muley is probably not the best because it doesn't really get big enough. But if I wanted to do like a switchgrass or something like that, I can start subbing in some of those characteristics that I really wanted to begin with. Or if I wanted a flowering tree that only gets 12 feet tall, like if, say, a redbud is not available, the one I want, the forest pansy is not available, maybe I'll go to like a Merlot or something that still has those qualities that I originally wanted. And that's why it's specific to be able to, that's why it's important to be able to communicate that specific quality that you wanted. So having that relationship where the installer can say, hey, I couldn't find any of these. And you say, okay, well, let's look at some other options that kind of still get to the meat of what the design was looking to do, which is
Yeah.
XYZ.
That's why site analysis is so important. So you can say, in this spot, it's a sunny spot with great drainage. I want a tree here, a 12-foot tall tree. Well, then we're not specific on what tree. If you give them a specific tree and they can't find it, at least they can find an alternative that meets all of those needs and will be good for that site. It just may not be the exact tree. And it's hard because I know y'all come across this a lot where you can't get certain plant material that maybe a client might want. And so you kind of have to pivot and be flexible.
Yeah, I mean, I will say I was fortunate that both the places I worked when I was in residential landscape, we actually had a nursery attached to it, which I loved because I could just walk out into the nursery and find the plant that I wanted to substitute myself and literally take it out to the site. So I'm a little probably luckier than most that are doing design when you don't always have that opportunity. But I think if you can do a final design that has or approved alternate, and then just have that communication with whoever's installing the plants and say, if you can't find this, let me know, and we can explore some other options of what you can find that can hit those needs that I need.
I guess you just got to be a little flexible.
I'm about to say, you got to be flexible. We as the people getting the design done, as plant people, need to be a little bit flexible as well. Like, I have to be flexible with the fact that I probably won't ever have a forest grove of ferns in my yard. I'll just have to create that forest grove of something that likes sun.
And a forest.
And I'll have to create a forest too. Yeah.
Okay. Excellent presentation, y'all. I really enjoyed this. You've gotten lots of good comments here in the chat box. I don't see any more questions. Does anybody else have any questions here? No? Wow.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Of course. Thank y'all so much. And if y'all ever have questions or anything about I can send the presentation to Carla as well. So y'all can have that. And yeah, we're always here to answer questions.
Okay, yes, that'd be great if you'd share with me the presentation, and I will upload the video onto our Google Drive. So, oh, wait, no, we do have a question.
Yeah, the designer, I mean, that's.
How do you pick the designer?
I mean,
Oof.
That-
Actually,
so-
I actually get that question a lot. And I will say design, like any art form, is in the eye of the beholder. And so finding someone you click with, who, when they talk about design, resonates with how you feel about it, I think is really important, because then y'all can speak the same language. If you're, for example, all about native plants, right? Like I want a native garden, my focus is native garden, and you have a designer that comes out and says, well, I would like to do, I don't know very much about native plants, and I tend to use other varieties or whatever. That you may not want to go with that person because you don't have the same design philosophy, and that's okay. I think it's a matter of clicking with a person, and just like a builder of a house, you want to have that relationship where you feel like you can trust them to do your landscape. So meeting with people, asking them questions about what kind of designs do you like? I always told people when I met with them, just make me a Pinterest board of stuff you like. I'd love to see how your thoughts are, what kind of designs you tend towards, what kind of plant material you like, what colors you tend toward in a landscape. And so you can have those conversations, and there's some people that you just don't click with, and that's okay. And there's other people that will, you feel like y'all are meant to work together. And I think it just takes a little bit of time sometimes to find that person that you can trust.
Shop around. You don't have to go with the first person you talk to.
Mm.
And price is important. So budgeting that out, talking with them very honestly about pricing and hourly work and things like that. And then also your local nurseries, places you go to buy plants and things like that. They work with designers often, especially design build firms that come out and they design and they get the plants and install, or design install, I guess. Talk with them, people you trust, landscape you've seen that you liked. It can be difficult to find that designer.
But if you go up to your friend's house and you're like, man, I really like your landscape, who did it, or who did your design? that's another good way to get some insider scoop, I guess, on style you like, because each designer is going to have their own style that they tend towards.
Mhm.
And so you want to make sure that it's the style you want to do, not that they can't do any other.
Look at their pictures.
Yeah,
Most
look at some of the landscapes they've designed or installed, and yeah, I think relationship's the most important thing.
Yeah, most will put like portfolios on their websites and things. Go through those and see if that's something that resonates with you and what you want to do in your landscape.
All right, thank you. Can you
Oh,
send
no.
me the names of the books and the authors?
Yes.
Just email that to me, because we've got a question in the chat and I was gonna ask about that anyway. If you could just go ahead and send me the names of the book and I'll share that with the whole class.
Yeah, I will. I'll send you all the books that I like, and then as well as the slides.
All right, sounds good. Well, thank you all. Just gonna make a couple announcements here. Next week is our last class, November 14th, and we are going to have a potluck. And so I think we've got a lot of people signed up. We got plenty of food coming. So if you can, try to come in person if you're not sick or something. I know we got a lot of people that are out with different things going on, and I'm sorry that y'all have been sick. Hope you get better soon. But we will have our plant diseases, and we'll have potluck. You'll take your post test. Yeah. So, that's it. All right, and thank you again.
Thank you. Y'all have a good night.
All right, you
night.
too.